Hello, we are in the Bulan Institute in Geneva. My name is Tiulegenov, and we have a great honor to be with Dr. Medet Tiulegenov, head of the International and Comparative Political Science faculty at the American University of Central Asia, and moreover, former head of the Soros Foundation in Kyrgyzstan. As the topic of our discussion is about security challenges in Central Asia, I would like to start my first question about one of the key issues about Afghanistan. So, how the situation in Afghanistan would affect us, and to what extent we should worry about that? I mean, ISIS is not completely defeated.
I think that Afghanistan is one of the key security issues for the whole Central Asian region, but I think it varies from country to country. There are three countries which many know which borders Afghanistan, and for them it's an immediate security issue. Whatever happens in Afghanistan, especially some skirmishes and conflicts in the north part of Afghanistan, that affects three countries: Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Of course, it's less of a concern for Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, but still there could be some ripple off effect in this regard. And in that sense, maybe there is not so much of a threat from Taliban, unlike from ISIS. And for governments of Central Asia, maybe the problem not so much comes from these two groups, but rather from local indigenous groups which fled to Afghanistan and reside there, like Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan or Islamic Movement of Turkmenistan, how they rename themselves. So that's maybe some of the security threats. It somehow affects the policies of some of the governments, at least in Central Asia, particularly of Uzbekistan. So in that sense, Afghanistan is also not the regional, but more wider, maybe to some extent, if not global, but an issue security issue draws attention of many actors like United States, Europe, and partially Russia, and to some extent China and India as well. So in that sense, security concerns are not only of those of Central Asian states, but also of much bigger powers. And of course, the United States was and still is one of the major actors, but I think it depends on how the current administration will look and approach with this America First principle and what happens in terms of withdrawal military and second development related programs and so forth. Europe is more engaged with Afghanistan, and to some extent they view, of course, as was in Central United States, Central Asia, as an additional factor to mitigate issues in Afghanistan. So Central Asia in itself has, again, tried just to reiterate, its own security issues with Afghanistan, but varies from country to country. Second, Central Asia is a proxy region for Afghanistan for other actors. Europe, to lesser extent now United States, and to some extent maybe Russia. So in that sense, Afghanistan, maybe if this moment of less importance of a security issue, especially given that there are some other issues of security concern which are rising within the region.
You've mentioned about the local groups of each country in Central Asia. So following on this, I would like to ask about religious extremism in Central Asia within the region. I mean, Islamization, it's growing really fast. So how would you assess the situation in the region? Has it become alarming or not yet?
I think the issue with religious extremism, it's quite a delicate and complex issue. It's delicate because it's quite intangible issue. There are certain religious groups which to some extent may be perceived as posing certain security threat to the governments or to the countries in Central Asia. But I think it varies because, as we know, some groups, they viewed as posing certain threat to the governments of Central Asia, but some are not viewed as a threat. Let's say Tablighi Jamaat is viewed not as extremist organization in Kyrgyzstan, but it's viewed as such in some other countries. So there are varied approaches, I think, in Central Asia. So we cannot say that Central Asia as a whole approaches in a similar way to many religious groups. But I think one of the issues with religious extremism is, again, this perception of threat. And then the second element is how this perception can be manipulated, because for the governments of Central Asia, it sometimes makes sense from a perspective of the regime security to present that some groups are posing a threat. But it's quite difficult to say to what extent. People can go to mosque, people can be more and more adhering to certain canons of Islam, but does it pose a threat? It's difficult to say. Of course, it creates some tension, at least in terms of what was the delineation between secularism and religious aspect of the function of the state. And it's been an issue for many countries, especially, let's say, for Kyrgyzstan, which is more or less open in this regard. Some other countries, they of course tried to ban and squeeze out the sphere of religious. It was done during the first presidency of let's say, of Uzbekistan and the Karimov. They squeezed out the religious active groups, which then become militarized. It was happening in Tajikistan as well, when the Islamic Renaissance Party was banned officially. And somehow this space of political religion is shrinking in that sense. Whether it's good or not, of course, it's again a matter how you use it. Perception of security threat. And then I think this war on terror, which started more than 17 years ago, somehow affected us. How the governments of Central Asia somehow aligned themselves with some governments in the West as well, viewing that some religious groups or religion itself can become as a source of threat.
So now I would like to ask you about the steps that were taken or should be taken by the governments of all 5 countries in the region. For example, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan on one side are taking really radical steps to fight against radicalization. What do you think about the efficiency of this kind of radical measures? And do we really need this kind of radical steps?
So again, I think countries in Central Asia, many of them are similar in a way how the political regime was developing, and hence how much of a political openness or maybe lack of that openness they allow, including openness for maybe active Islamic groups. And in that sense, countries are learning from each other, and their experiences somehow and their policies towards Islam, they've been transferred and diffused from one country to another. And in similar contexts, quite often they've been similarly approaching the same responses to the same issues. Let's say a country like Kyrgyzstan somehow stands out in this regard because we're much less authoritarian, we have more open political space, and we have weaker state capacity. Even if we would like, let's say, to control whatever we want to control, we lack capacity to do that. So in that sense, I think not all experience is transferable. And then it depends on what kind of values, maybe policy goals governments or countries have in this regard. Because you want to create stability and you're looking for stability at the expense of freedoms. That's maybe possible in some contexts. It may be justifiable, at least not normatively, but in terms of what these governments are thinking, like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan still. It's some policies which they've been pursuing for more than 2 decades now. In Uzbekistan, let's say, and not to mention about Turkmenistan. In Tajikistan, it's been a policy of the post-Civil War settlement, when there was, of course, this peace agreement and certain power sharing with the Islamic Renaissance Party, which then was disappearing, and now the party IRT has been banned altogether. So in that sense, of course, the space has been limited quite drastically. The 2 other countries remaining, again, Kyrgyzstan, to some extent, maybe Kazakhstan, they are somehow not so easily trying to deal in a different context with Islamic extremism. And in that sense, quite often, of course, what you can try to control is the external behavior of people, because you cannot control how people think. They can pray at home, they can think whatever they want to think. That's something which you can try to pick on and try to think that by regulating that, you can regulate religion. But it's, I think, a bit a tricky path, in my view, that radicalization is not the manifestation of the external appearances. People may not wear hijab, people may not have birds at all, but they may still turn radical if needed. So in that sense, I think these measures, they're not productive. And maybe at some point they can be viewed as a counterproductive, because sometimes you may instigate something you want to prevent, because people may even more radicalize because of certain prohibitions and certain pressures they can experience. Because quite often radicalization goes against the state. And if people, which yesterday were moderate, let's say Muslims, if they feel that there is some pressure against their religion, next day they may radicalize. And I think these policies can be backfiring.
So now we'll move on to the next question. It's about water dispute. And for example, 5 countries have shared water resources for a long time. And now upstream countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they do not possess oil and gas, so they have to use the surplus water for their own provision to get electricity. And however, the downstream countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that are rich in oil and gas, they're not happy with what upstream countries are doing.
And there are maybe several elements of that complex issue. One is the issue of the environment, and maybe mostly about the RLC disaster, which has been lasting for many decades already. Another issue is political tension, cross-border quite often between certain countries, which has been at least up to recently quite acute with the new government of Uzbekistan, which is quite central in this regard. What will happen, we should yet see. But bilateral relations of Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, Tajikistan quite often has been, I think, affected negatively by these water issues. So my hopes is that with the new government of Uzbekistan, things will improve in this regard. And seemingly there are some hopeful signs already, especially when it comes to the irrigation purposes of water usage in downstream countries, in Uzbekistan specifically, because quite often the issue is cotton production, and how the cotton production as a policy and the major sector of economy has been approached previously, somehow maybe slowly changing. And in that sense, its perspective and perception on Uzbek side is changing about the importance of the need of the having water. And probably some agreements, which at least on two sides, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, and hopefully maybe in the future with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan will happen, in terms of joint agreement on how the water management for electricity energy production will be handled, that will put at ease somehow the concerns of Uzbek side. Because if Uzbek government will feel that whatever construction of hydropower electrification is happening and whatever further reservoirs will be built in the Kyrgyz side, there is no threat in this regard to Uzbek side. And I don't know to what extent these negotiations will go far, let's say trying to engage Uzbek side into possible management of these projects somehow will put, I think, issues to more smoother, I think, resolution of these issues. So again, my view is that it's mostly political and it's mostly perception of security threat, that especially of downstream countries. So, and again, my hopes with the new Uzbek government, which somehow starts not with a blank sheet, of course, but there is certain legacy of previous leadership, but still, there are certain ways maybe how at least on two fronts, let's say one front of Uzbek and Kyrgyz relationship will improve, and that will set maybe a model and precedent how the same can be done with Uzbek and Tajik side. Also, of course, quite often rests how the Tajik government will perceive what they want to do together with Uzbekistan. If that will be resolved, I think most of the issues in the region in regard to water will be resolved, because there is not so much issues between upstream countries and Turkmenistan, and maybe not so much between, let's say, upstream countries and Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan is not so much affected, except maybe RLC as a specific issues. But again, the central element of that whole complex issues of water resources is Uzbekistan, and seemingly there are some hopeful signs in this regard, especially with the coming of the new Uzbek leadership.
So could you please share your perspectives on democracy and human rights in Central Asia?
It's an interesting question, but it's a bit difficult and complex issue for the region, because except Kyrgyzstan, there is not so much hopes and perspectives for democracy, especially we have high aspirations for what we mean by democracy. But I would try to go away from this clear dichotomy, autocracy versus democracy, but try to see it as a continuous scale. Let's say there could be less autocratic, a bit more democratic. And in that sense, maybe there is certain hopes for progress. Because not so much hopes at the moment in Turkmenistan, there is less prospects for democracy in Tajikistan. Unfortunately, that country situation is getting worse and worse. But Kyrgyzstan, of course, remains, if not the island of democracy that it used to be, but still something as a democracy within the region, compared to the neighbors, of course. Again, when we speak about Uzbekistan, we are not talking about democracy as a democracy, but we are talking maybe about liberalization. Of course, liberalization is not equal to democracy or democratization, but liberalization is a certain maybe preconditions for democratization, maybe in the near or maybe in the midterm future. And of course, compared to what has been under Karimov, what during the last year only the current president has done, it's already good progress. Can we call it democracy? Probably not. Can we call it liberalization? Maybe yes. Would he be able to abolish exit visas? That will give some hopes for freedom of movement. Will give at least some freedom to media. Maybe it will give at least some hopes for freedom of speech. We are not talking about freedom of speech as freedom of speech as we usually talk, but at least it's certain signs. And that's already could be good progress. Next country where could be some hopes, it's maybe Kazakhstan. But hopes may come with a question of succession, because it's the only country now which has the same person sitting at the head, the leading position for the last more than quarter of century. And then the issue in question, because people are aging, then somehow the transition naturally should happen. And how well that person and others in political elite can get ready for that, maybe we'll put the questions for liberalization as well. Because they tried to do something as a constitutional reforms, although it was a mock reform, but at least it was one of the signs that maybe they start to think about it. And something like liberalization, again, it's not equal to democratization, but liberalization possibly may happen in Kazakhstan as well. And the factor here will be succession and how to get ready for that. So looking at 5 countries in Central Asia, we can look definitely about Kyrgyzstan in terms of democratization. And maybe in terms of liberalization, which can be a certain precondition for democratization, we can look definitely at Uzbekistan, whatever small steps we have now, and maybe possibly in Kazakhstan. So in that sense, of course, when someone from Brussels, from Europe, from North America looks at Central Asia, we're still hopeless. But when someone looks closely and with microscope maybe at some countries in Central Asia, maybe we can see some progress. In that sense, maybe we're not again talking about democratization, but maybe we're talking about liberalization, which is still good from the question you're asking.
And we wish you successful implementation of your project with the Graduate Institute. Thanks once again.
Thank you very much for the questions and an interesting talk.